start to put some of the questions that you've put into the Q&A to the panelists. Just a reminder, I think we've probably already got more questions than we can answer. So please, could I ask our viewers, if you'd like to see a particular question asked, do vote for it by clicking on the thumbs up, and that way the question is more likely to be asked. So first up, I have a question from Judy Blakely, asking about gendered inequality in New Zealand and the role that plays. We've talked mostly in terms of wealth and income inequality in New Zealand. I wonder if I could ask each of the panelists, perhaps starting with you, Ganesh, to reflect on gender inequality in New Zealand.
Well, without wanting to sit on the fence, the Productivity Commission, in terms of our report, we didn't have that. Well, we searched for that data in terms of our dimensions and drivers, and we're restricted by the data, but it's well researched and well found in other areas around the gender pay gap. The way our labour market is structured doesn't allow for gaps in employment, and that impacts on lifetime earnings and lifetime opportunities. So yes, undoubtedly there is a gender dimension to inequality that we need to not only be aware of but to address. But I suppose without being too apologetic, it's one of those. I suppose it's one of the various dimensions, and everybody will have their own dimension. And one of the things that we struggled with in terms of our report is we did have many different organisations and individuals coming to tell us about what is the most important element that we needed to look at and address. All of those had well-researched case, but the challenge is to, dare I say, not wanting to belittle or downplay any of those individual dimensions, is to recognise that they all operate within that system. And undoubtedly that gender dimension for inequality is a reflection of that power imbalance that we've got embedded within the system. So yes, it's important to look at, but I wouldn't be looking at it in isolation to the broader system and all those other dimensions of inequality that are equally, I won't say depressing, but equally challenging to ensure that we address properly.
Thanks, Ganesh. Tanya, Max, any comments?
Well, I'll just briefly comment on women's inequality, that part of gender inequality. And one of the things that that we're really interested in is the care economy. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmingly, staffed by women. There is, a very clear case why the status of care need to be valued more. Hedge fund managers during those lockdowns, utterly useless. Nurses, care home assistants, those were the roles that we depended on. Our people in our supermarkets making sure that we were fed, that I would all consider to be part of the care economy. They make sure that our basic welfare is being looked after, our teachers. So I think there needs to be a fundamental reset in how we prioritise different things. There was a really interesting study that the New Economics Foundation did in London, and it found that hedge fund managers had the lowest social return on investment and cleaners the highest. Now, I think that says everything, but you can't have a dignified living as a cleaner or a carer, certainly not in Auckland. You just can't earn enough. I'd just like to also make the comment about debt. So it is lone parent families that have the lowest median net wealth, and that shouldn't surprise us, but it should worry us incredibly, and that disproportionately falls on women. Ngā Tangata Microfinance, who are a fantastic organisation tackling those high interest fringe lenders. The overwhelming majority of their clients are wahine. So it tells you about, you know, kind of like who is experiencing barriers to income and wealth, but also who's paying penalties on having to access incredibly expensive debt. The average interest rate that those wahine were paying to fringe lenders was 35%, and the equivalent of a third of their total income. No one can get up and out from that. And just the a final word is about family harm and domestic violence and violence against women. We are world champions in that regard. It is a shameful state of affairs. And the Growing Up in New Zealand study has looked at 5 different indicators. And what happens when you remove certain things from people's lives? Does it get them above or below the line of vulnerability? Now, you can remove any number of combination of those indicators. If you don't remove domestic violence, women stay vulnerable. They stay under that line, even if you are tackling other indicators like housing or income. So the women's equality issue is more than just the pay gap, and it goes right to the heart of some very fundamental values about how we think about the mana of women and our value and our role.
Kia ora, Tanya. Max, any quick reflections on that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, just a generalized reflection, sort of maybe less directly on the question itself, but on what Ganesh and Tanya have been picking up on. I think what we're talking about here is partly economic exclusion, exclusion from the fruits of the economy, but also democratic exclusion or civic exclusion, people not being able to participate actually in the systems of power and systems of decision making. And I read it, and I think sort of more and more that what that creates is sort of a downward spiral for a lot of people, where despite their best efforts, they're living in poverty or marginalization, and so they quite understandably don't engage in the political system, or the political system doesn't create opportunities for them to engage. And so then that system is oriented towards the interests of those who do vote and engage in the powerful. And so inequality just gets worse. And those two things are very self-reinforcing when they're both exclusionary. And so I think the task is to try to set things on the upward spiral. And instead, where we're reducing economic disparities, more people feel empowered to participate in our systems of democracy. And we change those systems so actually that they work for everyone. And so we create citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, and we have more co-governance structures and everything else that's required. And then politics will be more responsive, I think, to the demands to further reduce inequality and so on and so forth. So I think it's those two big interwoven things, partly, that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Max. Okay, so the next question comes from Anne French, and again, I'll put the question to all panelists. And just before I ask that, just to know, some of our panelists may not be able to comment on specific political party policies, so feel free to answer this question in terms of the policies that would be effective here. So the last 6 years have been disappointing for people concerned about child poverty and inequality in New Zealand, and the 30 years that preceded them weren't great either. Which parties or policies that address these problems would be worth our vote? So as I say, feel free to respond kind of in a more general sense about the policies that would be effective in addressing child poverty and inequality in New Zealand. Let's start with you, Tanya.
I'm one of those ones that has to be just a little bit careful, as I am employed as a public servant. But there is no doubt about it that we have a very long road ahead of us. One of our teams in our department is specifically looking at early years. And it includes working with a number of central government agencies to create systems change intervention. So not so much focused on what is it that parents need to be doing better, but to Ganesh's point about systems change, how does the public sector, which plays a huge role in people's lives, and particularly people who are at the very pointiest end of inequality, the state is, you know, in their lives fairly frequently. So what is it that the public sector can be doing better to create more enabling conditions, as actually described perfectly in the Productivities Commission's inquiry into fairness for all. I think that's probably where I would have to stop.
Great, thank you. Any quick reflections from Max or Ganesh?
Yeah, look, if I could add something to that, and actually, and I'll just see if I can share my screen again, because I happen to have a image on this. Hopefully everyone can see. This is a graph of child poverty rates. And look, these are the three main measures that the government uses to measure poverty under the Child Poverty Reduction Act. And I won't go into detail on them because we probably don't have time. But the overarching point is, if you go back to, just after the global financial crisis, so sort of 10, 15 years ago, the sort of rate, the number of children in poverty, it's up around 20, 25, 30% in some cases. And, over the last sort of decade plus, actually, there have been pretty significant reductions in child poverty on some measures, including the hardship ones, which are just directly about asking families, what they do and don't have. And for me, actually, this is a bit of one of the untold success stories of New Zealand recently, which is that we actually have made some real inroads. Now, I'm not saying that everything's fine, because those poverty rates are still 10, 15%. That's still one child in 10 in poverty, and those rates can be twice as high for children from Māori Pacific backgrounds or in families where there's an adult with a disability. So there's a huge amount to go, but we have made some progress. The target is to, go from sort of, 1 child in 5 being poor back in 2010 to 1 child in 10 now, to get that down to 1 in 20 in a few years' time. And both major parties, at least rhetorically, are signed up to that. And I actually think that's encouraging. I mean, Tana's quite right. There's a huge road to go, and there's some very, very entrenched structural inequalities. But I think we can take heart from the fact that we actually have achieved some things as a country overall.
Thanks, Max. Next question, I have the same disclaimer. Panelists should feel free to answer it in a general sense rather than speaking to, in this case, the Green Party specific proposals. So question from Sarah Salmon. Do the panelists think that the implementation of the Green Party's wealth tax and income guarantee would be beneficial for New Zealand? And the second part of the question, is there any realistic prospect of a capital gains tax being implemented in New Zealand in future as distinct from the bright line test? So I'll throw that open to the panel. Anyone would like to comment on it? Again, you can comment on the general principle of wealth taxes and income guarantees if you prefer.
I mean, I'm happy to have a go at that, because it's possibly the easiest question for me to answer as someone who doesn't have a public position. Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of merit in both. Some people do talk about a universal basic income, but I'm not a huge fan of that, in the sense of a payment that goes to literally everybody in the country, because then I think you have to spread the assistance too thin for it to be really meaningful. Conversely, the guaranteed minimum income, this idea that if you don't have income from paid work, you should receive a really generous benefit that allows you to live in dignity, and which, you don't sort of have to have huge amounts of means testing and questions about your partner's relationship and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of merit in that as something that helps restore dignity to people's lives, gives them that secure foundation from which they can build. And and I think there's a lot of merit in a wealth tax as well. I mean, a wealth tax is slightly more complex to make work than capital gains and inheritance taxes. I think the ideal scenario is you've got capital gains and inheritance taxes, so you're just taxing all kinds of income equally. and fairly. But it's absolutely true that if you don't have either of those, a wealth tax kind of gets you to the same point, because how do the very wealthy save up their wealth? It's mostly from capital gains and inheritances. So up to a point, it comes back to the same thing. But whatever happens, I think the crucial point is you do have a lot of New Zealanders who are paying very little of their income in tax, and we have to close that loophole.
Great, thank you, Max. If no other comments, I'll move on to the next question.
Yes, that's my comment.
Okay, very good. So the next question, in terms of narrowing the distribution of income, what would the panel see as the best ways of doing this? For example, raising low incomes or minimum wage, introducing living wages, or reining in upper income brackets? Again, I'll throw that question open to the panel.
I suppose I would respond in the context of it's, yes, income is important, and I go back to Max's comment about the link to opportunities. And I think the economists generally have, in terms of our training, have consistently focused on choices. And I think we need to think about economics and our economics training and think about the constraints on those choices. It is in our textbook. I mean, the choices were always within constraints, but we've always, economists of my generation anyway, have always assumed that those constraints were never binding. There was always something that they were always far off and we didn't have to worry about them. But now we are recognising that those constraints are binding for many individuals and communities, whether it be the income constraint or the lack of opportunities that are then provided. And so rather than, I suppose, you could go down the narrowing the income disparity, but I'd also want to, I think, openly put it alongside ensuring that we have proactive measures to build opportunities across our communities and our individuals and households and regions and everywhere. And so whether that's the active labour market policies in terms of employment policies, whether that's education and workforce training, or dare I say, go all the way back to those first 1,000 days and let's start putting that investment into our whānau and our families to provide that safe nest to nurture our next generation.
Thank you, Ganesh. Tanya?
I think it's all of those and more. So Max made the point, I think, about union membership, and there was a comment about that in the chat. It's no coincidence that after the Employment Contracts Act and what that did to the union movement, that Māori incomes, decreased pretty much overnight by 9%. So the more protections we have for Māori and Pasifika, the benefit is disproportionate. When we have those types of protections in the labour market, or whether it's an industrial policy, whatever it might be. I think there's also some very tactical things that we need to do. South Auckland is hit over the head consistently. The reason you're poor is because you're uneducated, and there's some kind of moral deficit in there usually as well. And it's always the supply side problem, right? But actually what we are finding is, what do you think happens when you've had an economy here, Tāmaki Makaurau, that has treated South Auckland like an unending reservoir of cheap brown labour for the last 50 years? Guess what happens? And we see that in the Equal Opportunities, Employment Opportunities Commissioner Whaikaranina's work around, we can't explain some of the Pasifika pay gap. It can't be explained by lack of qualifications. It goes to Ganesh's point earlier about racism. We need to be, most South Aucklanders work, right? The problem is stuck in work poverty. And so we've seen like huge rates of underutilization. So we've got a little prototype that's happening at the moment, which is actually putting the responsibility on the demand side. So we're literally moving underutilized Pasifika workers out of those crappy jobs and into deserving employers, and literally doubling people's income. Now, that's a very, kind of pragmatic thing to do. But the first thing we had to do was properly diagnose the problem. What I see amongst my colleagues in the public sector, we need more training programs or da-da-da-da-da. Actually, yes, and we need more thorough analysis of what is actually happening. And so we, looked at the ILO's total utilisation work and applied that as a lens over what is happening in South Auckland, and that has led to these types of prototypes to show that actually we need to be doing multiple things all at the same time.
Kia ora, Tanya. We're rapidly running out of time here, so if I could ask one panel member to reflect on, we've had a few questions about the interplay between climate change and inequality. If one of Tanya, Max, or Ganesh could quickly reflect on that, and then we'll draw the webinar to a close.
I'm quite happy to, climate change is just yet another, I won't say just yet another, that downplays it, but is another impact that is going to hurt the vulnerable even more. So and again, I suppose it's part of that social contract. What are our obligations? Myself, as one in the privileged sector of the world, what are our obligations back the other way in terms of looking after the vulnerable communities who are not vulnerable for any of their choices? They are vulnerable because of the way the system has functioned. And so what are the obligations, responsibilities in that direction? And so whether it's climate change or whether it's that cost of living crisis or whatever it is, the question for me is, what are our obligations at that community level? Because climate change and all those other challenges, we're only ever going to solve it at that community and national level. Individuals on our own are not going to be able to solve or address those challenges at all.